Dear audience, today, our association aims to increase awareness about academic ethics at universities and among academicians and students in Turkey. And also we aim to be an international association. To reach this aim, we try to get in touch with international important people, important academicians. And today our guest is Professor Irene Glendinning from Coventry University. She is now academic manager for student experiences there. After completing her own PhD, focusing on policies for academic integrity internationally, she led a global study into how accreditation and quality assurance bodies are responding to different forms of corruption in higher education. She's part of the team that organized the International Days of Action Against Contract Cheating, starting in October 2016, and is Vice President for the European Network for Academic Integrity. She has worked on corruption at universities, and she's an expert on corruption at universities. First of all, Professor Glendinning, can you define corruption at universities? What should we understand by corruption at universities, and can you provide some examples of corruption at universities?
Okay, let me just correct something. Some of your biographical information is a bit out of date. I'm no longer the Vice President of the European Network for Academic Integrity, so I stepped down from that post about a year ago, something like that. So but I'm still very heavily involved with the organisation. So I don't want to be seen to be corrupt. It's very important. We have to be very honest and okay. And my current role at the university, although that's still my job title, I'm actually now the lead in the institutional lead in academic integrity for my institution. So I'm responsible for all the policies that we have in my institution. So back to your question. The way that we define, for the purposes of the study, we used very similar to the Transparency International's definition of corruption. It's a deliberate act. So it's a deliberate act to gain an unfair advantage. And that advantage might be to do with your kind of academic standing. It might be to do with a qualification, or it might be to do with might be financial. So there are various modes to realise. So, but it's a deal. So that's the kind of definition that we're using. So something like a student plagiarising wouldn't be considered to be corruption unless they were deliberately aware of what they were doing, and it was very large scale. So that's the kind of thing that we're the distinction there. So examples in the study, we actually looked at different levels within a university, within the higher education sector, starting at the government, starting at the top level. So if you think about corruption that affects the higher education sector as a whole, happening right at the very top level from the government or government ministries. So it could be, for example, it could be government interference where they're overriding the actual the regulations, the kind of the governance of the institution. And I know that's happened in Turkey, where that can override, where they actually appoint a rector or a vice chancellor, where the normal process within the institution is to appoint. So that it's that kind of thing. So that I would see that as a form of corruption. But also things like it could be financial, it could be members of the university with procurement contracts who are actually personally gaining or have conflicts of interest that they haven't declared, those kind of things. It could be to do with external agencies accrediting an institution where there's bribery or money changing hands in order to get a positive outcome from that process. So that's at the top level. And then if we could kind of go down a level, the kind of institutional governance, corruption in teaching, perhaps to do with qualifications to become an academic. Those could be faked or inflated. Academics demanding bribes of students, for example, that would be another example. Academics changing student grades in return for favours from a student. So that's the kind of lots of things like that. And then at the student level, it could be to do with certainly contract cheating would be an example of that. And what I mean by contract cheating is the student getting someone else to do their work for them. And I'm using that very advisedly. It could be for payment, or it could be by some other, for some other reason. It could be a family member who does the work for them, for example. It doesn't have to be an essay mill. So that would be another form of corruption, sort of using an essay mill. And then we can go down, to a different part of the university function. We're looking at the admissions and recruitment. A lot of corruption goes on in the form of kind of bribes to and from agents to recruit students and admit students to universities. There's been some really good examples recently in the United States of that happening, where celebrities have been paying for huge bribes to agents to get their kids in, using these sports scholarships. So there are lots of examples of that, and that happens. We found that kind of thing happens to different degrees in different countries. And then, of course, the other thing to look at is credentials, qualifications. A lot of fake universities, a lot of people sort of buying degrees, but also we've come across, particularly in Russia, there's a whole network of people who seem to be able to get degrees by paying prestigious universities money, and the powers that be in the universities allowing this person to gain a degree without actually going through, particularly PhDs. So you can get a PhD by not doing a lot of work, by just paying money for it. So, and that involves not just the person who's getting the degree, but it involves a chain of people within the institution that's allowing that to happen. So that's a kind of a really wide scale type of corruption. And then, of course, this is a very long answer to a very short question, I know, but then, of course, we've got to look at the research and academic publishing side of this. So there's a lot of corruption goes on within research itself. There's been lots of work recently about fake data. And I read yesterday Elizabeth Blick had got an award for her work exposing fake data and fabrication, and so there's a lot of work going on there, and that is something that's never been really pursued in any great detail. But there's a lot of that goes on where people just completely fake results and invent papers, and then the work that I've been doing a lot recently is working on predatory publishing. But there are all sorts of other, and I know that's a big problem within Turkey itself. And so there are whole peer review gangs, particularly coming from China. And the problem with China is that they give cash bonuses to academics for publishing in index papers, particularly in international papers. And that's driving a whole behavior within China that's forcing or causing groups of academics to subvert the academic publishing process, either by hijacking journals, taking them over, or by other means like that, like sort of getting your friends to do the peer review for you in return for, vice versa. So that you end up publishing a paper that hasn't really been peer reviewed. But then, of course, the predatory publishing industry itself is a huge corrupt area, which is just about making money by certain individuals. Very long answer, but you can see corruption is everywhere. It's global. It is in different. It occurs in different ways in different parts of the world. But there's nowhere that we found that's exempt from corruption within higher education.
So we can say that misconduct, academic misconduct and corruption are close concepts.
They are. If it's something that's done, if it's some misconduct that's happened through ignorance or through just not understanding, then I wouldn't class that as corruption. But if it's done in a deliberate way to gain an unfair advantage, then I would say that is corruption.
Okay, what are the main reasons of corruption at universities and what can be done to prevent corruption?
Yeah, well, I gave you an example just now about China, where they are required to, or if academics publish in index journals, which the government is encouraging to do, to try and improve the profile of China as a research, as a kind of higher education, its research profile. They want academics to publish in these international journals, so they were giving cash bonuses. So that's one example of it. Another example is where people are paid just not enough money. So in some countries, academics are paid such a low amount of money. The cash flow is very poor. So academics have to do several jobs just to live, just to earn enough money to live. And those people are then very susceptible to bribes. So, to make a bit of extra money, you might just overlook a student cheating, or you might just improve a student grade and accept a bribe from a student. So that's another kind of driver for corruption. So I know in Turkey, you have a rule that requires PhD students to publish, is it 5 papers, something like that, within their PhD before they can actually graduate?
One paper.
Is it one?
One, it depends on the university. In some universities, maybe more than one.
Yeah, okay. So that kind of thing is difficult because often a PhD student should really be focusing in on their research and their PhD rather than the academic publishing process. Because it's really, and I know it's really hard to get published in a high-ranking journal.
Yeah.
So for a PhD student to get published in a high-ranking journal is really hard, and so that can drive some behaviour where they might actually fake some data, or they might. So there are all sorts of drivers like that. So those are some of the reasons. In some countries, though, as you're possibly aware yourself, corruption is within society anyway. It's the normal way of life. It's normalised. That's the way the economy is driven through corruption. So if you're in a higher education institution within a country that is kind of fundamentally driven by different forms of corruption, I'm thinking of countries here like Albania, Bulgaria, maybe Russia, countries like that, Nigeria, where there's a lot of corruption in society. That spills over into higher education, that people don't see this behaviour as corrupt. They see that as the normal way of doing things. I remember I did an interview in Armenia and talked to people in Armenia, really well-meaning people, really kind of full of integrity, but what they thought was normal behaviour, such as talking to one vice dean, and he was telling me that he had personal friends, and it's expected that if the children of these personal friends need help to get through their education, he is required to do that, otherwise he'd be an outcast in society. So it's kind of personal loyalties can often drive corruption, and people don't see that as corruption. They see that as the way that life functions as normal. So conflicts of interest are often not declared and ignored. And what that vice dean should have done is pass the problem to someone else to look for, on the basis that he had a conflict of interest, so he couldn't actually deal with that problem. But it's those kind of things. So those are some of the drivers. So your next question, I think, was what can be done about it, and the answer to that is really hard, because it depends on the society that you're living in. And it's easy for me from the UK to say, oh, well, I just report it. As an academic, I have to report everything. If I found corruption, I have a way of reporting it through our system. But even then it's difficult, because if it was one of the managers who is being corrupt, who do I then report it to? So having a reporting system is really quite important, and having a way of independently reporting something. So basically within an institution, if there is corruption from the top, it's actually really difficult to do anything about corruption within the institution. So although it's everyone's responsibility, right down to the students as well, to report any and to make it easy for people to report and to kind of anonymize the reporting, it's not easy to do that within a culture where the hierarchy, the management hierarchy, or the leadership of the institution is subject to corruption as well. So there isn't an easy answer. It depends on your situation. And basically the leadership for this, for anti-corruption, needs to come from the top of the institution, and everyone needs to set an example for that. Okay. So does that help? Does that kind of answer the question?
Go ahead, please.
So, sorry, I kind of finished like that answer. I could go on a bit more, but that kind of lost my train of thought on that one.
Okay, how does corruption affect academic quality and standards?
Well, fundamentally, I would say, because if you can't, if I can use the term integrity, if you don't have integrity within academia, within research, within the kind of teaching function of the university, then you can't have quality. Your quality is compromised, and you cannot be certain of your standards. So your academic standards and quality are underpinned by the integrity within the institution. If you don't have integrity, then your quality and standards are compromised.
So if we go back to the previous question, transparency might help to prevent corruption. Also, the system. The system of the management system of countries is also an important determinant of corruption as well. Maybe we can say
I would say transparency and accountability. Yeah, so individuals must be accountable for their actions, and the processes and the systems within the institution should be transparent. But as I said, the leadership has to come from the top on making sure that people are aware that if there is any kind of malpractice, whether it's corruption or it's accidental, whatever, that will be monitored for within the systems and processes within the institution. And also it will be recorded, and there will be consequences. So if it's student conduct particularly, but also if it's staff conduct, all of that needs to be recorded and appropriate action taken. So that it's the kind of monitoring and addressing taking action when it's found. All of that is important. And if people see that's not happening, and and their tendency is to be in some way corrupt, then they won't be deterred by just being told that they have to behave with integrity. So you need to have the carrot and the stick, because you're never going to get rid of corruption altogether. There'll always be, particularly in a large community, there'll always be some members of that group, for whatever reason, whether they're driven, whether the drivers are that are forcing them to behave like that, or whether they don't realise it's wrong. There will always be people who resort to corruption. So it's really very important that measures are taken within every institution to monitor and to deal with it, and that is seen to be done, so that it acts as a deterrent against the individuals. But the leadership must come from the top, and the systems and processes should be there. But that's also the other thing that I strongly believe has to happen, and it doesn't happen in every country, is that there should be regular updates and training for staff on what we mean by academic integrity, and how that plays out in terms of their day-to-day activities, either with students or in their research or in their publications and so on. So the processes and systems within the institution can help that a lot. But if if the corruption occurs at the highest level of the institution, who do you then appeal to? Who is the person that you then report that to if it occurs within within the hierarchy, within the management, or within the leadership of the institution? So in that case, in some countries there are ombuds people, ombudsmen, ombudswomen, that are external to the institution, and that can be channels for reporting corruption within the institution. So that's quite useful. Or it could be that you report it anonymously to the quality agency or the accreditation agency that is responsible for oversight of the institution, external oversight. So, but all of those things need to be in place within the country or state within the institution itself. So I think there's a whole different set of layers of support that could be provided and sort of channels for reporting. But people are not going to report if they realise that nothing's going to be done about it. Because, and they're also not going to report unless their identity is protected. So the protection of the identity of whistleblowers is really, really important as well. Yeah. So they need to have some reassurance that will happen, and that they will not then become the victim or the target of the perpetrator. So I think the kind of whistleblowing system is really quite important, and we have that within our institution, where we do encourage students to whistleblow, for example, but also staff can whistleblow as well, and external people. So we do deal with that.
Okay.
Well,
corruption is a barrier to development of, corruption at universities. We are focusing on corruption at university right now.
Yeah.
In this short interview. Corruption at universities is a barrier to the development of countries and also to development of science. Is it true?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. But on the converse of that is that universities have a particularly important role to play in changing society, and it's not easy to do that. So within a society where there is corruption, and that really applies everywhere, but the integrity of the graduates from an institution can begin to influence society and influence the wider society, the kind of public consciousness and so on. So if universities get it right and their graduates leave them with a sense of really strong sense of integrity when they go out into the workplace, into the wider world, that can start to have an impact on society, on corruption in society in general. So I think they play a really important role in that.
Okay, so the image of universities in societies is very important.
Yes.
And this corruption at universities probably damage the image of the universities, and also people lose their trust to the universities.
That's right. It's public trust, and that's a really important part of the university to have that public trust and to be trusted by, and so that the outputs from the university, both in terms of the students going out into the wider world with their qualifications, there needs to be trust in the value of those qualifications and the standards of the institution. But there also, as we've seen very recently with all the research that's been going on about COVID, it's really important that people value and trust the scientific knowledge that's coming out of the universities. And that's why scientific publishing is such an important part of that, because if you can't disseminate your research in a reliable way, that's going to start to erode the trust that the public have on academia. So that's a really important part of it, and it all comes back to the kind of quality and standards of the institution, and the fact that they are dealing with any corruption, any malpractice within the institution itself, and that they can show that they're doing that.
Okay. Probably those people who administer the countries have relationship with the academicians at universities and the administration of universities, and this relation probably affects the corruption level at universities. What can you say about that? How does the relationship between politicians and academicians affect corruption?
Well, I would say institutional autonomy is really fundamental.
Yeah. Really
fundamental. And if politicians start to interfere in the governance of institutions, then that autonomy is eroded. And that means, and it's coming out a lot in things like free speech, isn't it, at the moment? And I don't know the answer to that question about where, you know, the kind of openness to be able to speak about what you want to speak about, and where that kind of overlaps with where you would want to stop somebody saying something that you know to be fundamentally untrue. So the communication from the institution itself with the wider society is really vital, but also the lack of interference from politicians, and certainly making sure that the leadership of the institution is independent of the government and not beholden to the government is really vital to the independence of the university, and to their ability to decide what they're going to teach, what they're going to research, and all of those things, and not interfering with those elements.
Okay. Well, that was my final question. If you have any final words, I can take them, and otherwise I will finish the interview.
I would, my final words, because we've been talking very negatively, as we tend to do about when we talk about corruption.
Yes.
We talk about all the negatives, and what I like to do as much as possible is to think about the positive sides of it. And I think we need to kind of turn it on its head and say, what can we do to improve integrity within teaching, education in general, but also within research and publication. So we need to kind of focus on the integrity side of it much more. And I, you know, that is really my aim, is to improve integrity by reducing corruption and malpractice. I think that's a way to look at it. And certainly within my institution, our strategy is very much to do with education, and education about integrity for everybody, education about how they can improve that integrity, but also education for everybody, for the students, for everyone that's involved with students, and have very strong and fair policies and systems, and make sure they're consistent across the institution so that everybody's treated very fairly.
Thank you very much. Have you been to Turkey, Professor?
I have indeed. I've been to Turkey several times.
You know Turkey.
So I don't know all of Turkey, but I spent a really lovely week in Turkey in 2019 with my friend Salim Razi from Çanakkale.
I'm in contact with Salim. He's a nice guy.
He is lovely, and so we had a as part of some research that we conducted, because we actually conducted some research in Turkey. We had a week of data collection within Turkey itself. So it was all kind of Istanbul, as far as where do we go to? But it's that kind of both sides of the Bosphorus. We didn't go into the Far East part of Turkey. But yes, I love Turkey. It's a lovely country, and I'm looking forward to going back there very soon.
Thank you very much for this interview. It was really a great contribution to the mission of our association. Thank you very much, Professor Glendinning.
Thank you for talking to me.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye then.